Ancient Egypt left behind pyramids, tombs and beliefs meant to last forever, yet hidden among them are unfinished burials, missing bodies, erased queens, and afterlife rules that were never fully settled. These are real mysteries found in stone, not legends. In this documentary, we explore the parts of Egypt that didn't go as planned, and what they reveal about a civilization still learning how to face eternity. The unfinished obelisk of Aswan. On the eastern bank of the Nile, near the modern city of Aswan, lies a site that reveals more about ancient Egyptian engineering than any completed monument ever could. Carved directly into the bedrock of a granite quarry is a massive stone structure, abandoned mid-creation, frozen in the moment of its making. This is the unfinished obelisk, and it offers a rare, unfiltered look into how the ancient Egyptians worked stone on an almost unimaginable scale. Unlike standing obelisks that dominate temple entrances across Egypt, this one never left the ground. It remains attached to the rock from which it was carved, measuring over 42 metres in length and weighing an estimated 200 tons. Had it been completed and erected, it would have been the largest obelisk ever made. The unfinished obelisk is not impressive because it was completed. It is important because it was not. Most Egyptian monuments hide the process behind perfection. Tool marks are polished away, mistakes are erased. This site preserves everything: the cuts, the errors, the decisions, and ultimately the reason the project was abandoned. The quarry at Aswan was one of the primary sources of granite for ancient Egypt. The stone extracted here was used for obelisks, statues, sarcophagi, and architectural elements across the kingdom. Granite was chosen not for ease but for durability. It symbolized permanence, power, and divine authority. Working granite is extremely difficult. It is harder than copper, which was the primary metal available to Egyptian workers during much of their history. The unfinished obelisk shows how they solved this problem. The surface of the stone is covered with thousands of shallow, rounded depressions. These are the marks left by dolerite pounding stones, harder stones used to crush and chip away granite gradually. Rather than cutting clean lines, workers pulverized the rock through repeated impact. This was slow, controlled labour. Teams of workers would have stood along the length of the obelisk, striking the granite rhythmically, removing material centimetre by centimetre. The process required planning, patience, and coordination. The obelisk was carved directly out of the bedrock, with trenches cut along its sides and underneath, slowly isolating it from the surrounding stone. The scale of the operation suggests centralised organisation. This was not experimental work. It followed a standardised method used repeatedly across centuries. The obelisk shape itself was symbolic, representing a petrified ray of the sun god Ra, linking the pharaoh to divine order. Based on inscriptions and stylistic dating, the unfinished obelisk is believed to date to the reign of Queen Hatshepsut, around the 15th century BCE. Hatshepsut commissioned numerous obelisks to assert her legitimacy as pharaoh in a male-dominated tradition. These monuments were political statements carved in stone. This obelisk was likely intended for the temple complex at Karnak. So why was it abandoned? The answer lies in a flaw that runs along its length. A large crack developed in the granite during the final stages of carving. This fracture would have compromised the structural integrity of the entire monument. Granite cracks unpredictably, and once such a flaw appeared, the risk of catastrophic failure during extraction or transport became too great. The decision to abandon the obelisk reflects something important. The ancient Egyptians were not reckless. They did not force monuments into existence at any cost. Despite the immense labour already invested, the project was halted. The stone was left where it lay. No attempt was made to repair it, because repair was impossible at that scale. The site was simply abandoned and work shifted elsewhere. This decision shows an understanding of engineering limits. It also shows pragmatism. Even in a civilization known for monumentality, failure was accepted when necessary. The unfinished obelisk also reveals how obelisks were meant to be extracted. The trenches surrounding it show that workers planned to detach the obelisk from the bedrock only at the final stage. Wooden wedges may have been inserted into channels and soaked with water, expanding to help separate the stone. Once freed, the obelisk would have been moved using sledges, ropes, and lubricated tracks toward the Nile. Transporting such a massive object would have required careful timing, likely during the annual inundation when water levels were high enough to float heavy barges. This coordination between quarrying, seasonal flooding, and temple construction reflects long-term planning on a national scale. The unfinished state also answers modern questions about tool use. There is no evidence of advanced machinery or lost technology at this site. The marks are consistent with known tools. The work was achieved through labour, organisation, and time, rather than mechanical shortcuts. The achievement is no less impressive because of this. It is more so. The quarry itself tells a broader story about Egyptian society. Quarrying operations were state-controlled. Workers were likely skilled labourers. The cracked obelisk that was never raised. If you walk through the granite quarries of Aswan slowly, without rushing toward the famous monuments, you begin to notice that the most revealing stories are not found in what ancient Egypt completed, but in what it chose to leave behind. Among the cut trenches and scarred bedrock lies an obelisk that never reached the Nile, never stood upright, and never carried the name of a king. It remains exactly where it was abandoned, marked by a crack that ended the project long before it could become a monument. This obelisk was not meant to be different from the others. It followed the same plan, the same proportions, the same symbolic purpose as the great obelisks that still stand at Karnak, Luxor, and beyond Egypt's borders. It was intended to rise vertically as a stone embodiment of the sun's ray, linking the authority of the pharaoh to divine order. Everything about its shape and placement suggests it was part of a serious state-directed project, not an experiment or a mistake. The difference is not intention, the difference is outcome. The cracked obelisk lies partially freed from the bedrock, surrounded by trenches that show just how advanced the work had become. Ancient quarry workers did not cut large blocks and shape them elsewhere. They carved monuments directly out of living rock, isolating them gradually by cutting channels along their sides and beneath their base. This process allowed careful control, but it also meant that any flaw revealed during carving could not be undone. Granite was chosen because it symbolized permanence, strength, and eternity. Yet granite is also unpredictable. It forms under immense geological pressure, and within its crystalline structure are natural weaknesses that remain invisible until stress exposes them. As workers removed material from around the obelisk, the balance of forces inside the stone changed, and along one such hidden weakness, the granite fractured. The crack was not superficial. It ran deep enough to threaten the entire structure. For a monument like an obelisk, this kind of fracture was decisive. Obelisks were tall, narrow, and heavy, and raising them was one of the most dangerous engineering operations in the ancient world. The stone would have to be transported over land, loaded onto barges, floated along the Nile, and finally raised upright using ramps, ropes, levers, and controlled counterweights. Even a flawless block required precision and caution. A cracked one would have been almost certain to snap under its own weight. The moment this fracture appeared, the builders would have known the risk immediately. What happened next is where the story becomes deeply human. There was no attempt to repair the crack, no effort to reshape the stone, no insistence on continuing out of pride or religious pressure. The work stopped. That decision tells us more about ancient Egyptian engineering than any finished monument ever could. It shows that these builders were not driven blindly by symbolism or royal command. They were professionals who understood material limits and accepted them. Even after months or years of labour, they chose safety and realism over completion. Standing at the site today, you can still see where the tool marks end abruptly near the fracture, as if the workers simply recognised the moment when further effort no longer made sense. There is no sign of chaos or collapse, only a quiet halt. The stone was left in place and attention moved elsewhere. This silence is important. Ancient Egypt is often portrayed as a civilization of absolute power and unquestioned authority, but the cracked obelisk shows a more measured reality. Monument building was not reckless. It involved evaluation, judgment, and a willingness to abandon projects when the risk became unacceptable. The crack itself follows a natural fault in the granite, reminding us that even the most experienced quarry workers could not always predict the behaviour of stone at such a scale. They did not possess modern scanning tools, but they relied on observation, experience, and collective knowledge passed down over generations. When failure occurred, they recognised it and acted accordingly. The cracked obelisk also explains why the obelisks that were successfully raised are so remarkably intact. What we see today is not the result of luck, but of selection. Stones with fatal flaws were rejected early and never entered the monumental record. This site preserves that hidden process. In this way, the cracked obelisk represents all the monuments we never see, the projects that ended quietly when reality intervened. It shows that ancient builders were not obsessed with completion at any cost. They understood that stone could not be negotiated with, only respected. There is something profoundly human in that choice. Someone, likely a master quarryman or overseer, stood here and made a decision that prevented disaster. That person left no name, no inscription, no credit, yet their judgment is still visible thousands of years later in a crack that was allowed to speak for itself. As time passed, the quarry continued to operate. Other stones were selected, other obelisks were completed and raised. This one remained behind, not as a failure, but as an honest record of limits encountered and accepted. The cracked obelisk does not suggest lost technology or forgotten machines. The granite boxes left empty at Saqqara. Beneath the sands of Saqqara, not far from the step pyramid of Djoser, there is a place that feels different the moment you enter it. The air is cooler, the light fades quickly, and sound seems to disappear into stone. Long underground corridors stretch forward, cut deep into the bedrock, leading to chambers that hold objects so massive and so precisely made that even modern visitors struggle to understand why they exist at all. This is the Serapeum of Saqqara, and within it sit some of the largest granite boxes ever carved by human hands. These boxes are not small. Each one weighs between 60 and 100 tons, carved from solid granite or diorite, transported from quarries hundreds of kilometres away, lowered into narrow underground galleries, and positioned with astonishing precision. Their surfaces are flat, their corners sharp, their interiors hollowed with care. Lids weighing tens of tons sit nearby, fitted so closely that even today a blade of paper cannot easily pass between lid and box. And yet, many of these boxes were found empty. The Serapeum was discovered in the 19th century by the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette, who followed ancient references to a sacred burial place associated with the Apis bull cult. What he uncovered was not a simple tomb, but an underground complex unlike anything else in Egypt. Long tunnels led to side chambers, each holding one of these massive granite containers, arranged in sequence like silent sentinels. According to ancient texts, the Serapeum was used to bury the sacred Apis bulls, animals believed to be earthly manifestations of the god Ptah. When an Apis bull died, it was mummified and buried with great ceremony. In theory, each granite box was meant to hold the remains of one bull, but the reality uncovered by archaeology complicates that explanation. When Mariette opened many of the boxes, he did not find intact mummies. In several cases, the boxes were completely empty. In others, they contained only fragments of bone, resin, or organic residue, nothing proportional to the immense effort involved in creating and sealing such containers. This immediately raised questions that have never been fully resolved. Why build containers of such precision and scale for remains that are either missing or minimal? To understand why this matters, it is important to consider the effort involved. Granite is one of the hardest stones available in Egypt. Carving it requires sustained labour using pounding stones and abrasives, shaping surfaces slowly and deliberately. Hollowing out the interior of a granite box to such flatness and symmetry would have taken years. Transporting it into underground tunnels would have required planning, coordination, and absolute precision. This was not decorative work. It was deliberate, expensive, and controlled. The tunnels of the Serapeum are narrow, sometimes barely wider than the boxes themselves. This means the boxes were placed before the corridors were fully finished, or that the corridors were carved specifically to fit them. Either way, the architecture was designed around the boxes, not the other way around. This suggests the boxes were the central purpose of the entire complex. The lids themselves deserve attention. Each lid weighs tens of tons and fits its box with extraordinary accuracy. The mating surfaces are smooth and level, showing no signs of rough handling. Lowering these lids into place would have required careful alignment and slow, controlled movement. Once sealed, reopening them would have been extremely difficult, which makes the emptiness more puzzling. If the boxes were sealed with ritual significance, why are so many found without their intended contents? Some scholars suggest looting, but this explanation has limits. Looters usually leave damage. They break lids, crack corners, leave debris behind. In the Serapeum, many boxes show no signs of forced entry. Others suggest that organic material simply decayed. But mummified remains, especially those treated with resins and oils, often leave clear traces. In some boxes, even those traces are minimal or absent. This does not mean the boxes were never used. It means their use may not align perfectly with our expectations. One possibility is that the Serapeum underwent phases of use and reuse over centuries. The Apis cult spanned long periods, and burial practices evolved. Some boxes may have been prepared in advance, never filled, or cleared for later rituals that were never completed. Another possibility is that the boxes held something temporary rather than permanent. Ritual objects, symbolic materials, or remains meant to be moved later. Ancient Egyptian religion was complex, and not all sacred actions were intended to leave permanent physical traces. What matters is that the boxes themselves were treated as sacred objects, not just containers. Their precision suggests symbolic importance beyond simple burial. In Egyptian belief, containment, sealing, and isolation had deep meaning. Sacred power was often controlled through enclosure. The act of sealing something away could be as important as what was sealed. In this context, an empty box does not necessarily mean absent. The pyramid that was abandoned. Halfway. South of Cairo, on the edge of the desert where cultivated land gives way to open sand, there stands a pyramid that looks unlike any other in Egypt. From a distance, it does not resemble the smooth triangular form people expect. Instead, it rises like a massive tower, surrounded by a mountain of broken stone, as if the pyramid itself has shed its outer skin and been left exposed. This is the Meidum Pyramid, and it is one of the most important failures in architectural history. Meidum was never meant to look this way. When construction began, this pyramid was intended to be perfect. It was designed to represent a new idea in Egyptian monument building, a transition from earlier step pyramids to the true smooth-sided pyramids that would later define the Old Kingdom. Meidum was a bridge between two architectural worlds, and that position made it both ambitious and vulnerable. The pyramid is traditionally attributed to Pharaoh Sneferu, the first great builder of the 4th dynasty, although construction may have begun under his predecessor Huni. Whoever initiated the project, it was clear from the beginning that Meidum was meant to demonstrate progress, confidence, and permanence. It was not a secondary monument, it was intended to stand as a fully realised royal pyramid. The original design of Meidum began as a step pyramid, built in layers that rose upward like a staircase toward the sky. This was a familiar and proven form, following the tradition established by Djoser at Saqqara. But at some point during construction, the plan changed. The steps were filled in, transforming the structure into a smooth-sided pyramid, a radical shift in design philosophy. This decision marked a turning point in Egyptian architecture. Instead of building outward from a stable base, the builders attempted to convert an existing stepped core into a smooth pyramid by adding layers of casing stone at a steep angle. The outer stones were laid not horizontally, but slanted inward, relying heavily on the integrity of the underlying structure. This was a bold experiment. At first, it appeared successful. The pyramid rose higher, its smooth sides gleaming in the sun, its silhouette unlike anything Egypt had seen before. But beneath the surface, structural problems were developing. The foundation of Meidum rested on sand rather than solid bedrock, and the method used to add the outer casing placed enormous stress on the lower layers. Over time, gravity did what it always does. The outer layers began to shift. At some point, either during construction or not long after completion, a catastrophic collapse occurred. Large portions of the outer casing slid away from the core, crashing down and forming the vast debris field that still surrounds the pyramid today. What remains is the inner core, standing tall like a tower, stripped of its intended form. The crucial question is not whether Meidum failed, but when. Archaeological evidence suggests that the collapse happened early, possibly during Sneferu's reign. There are no signs of long-term use as a burial pyramid, no clear evidence that Sneferu was ever buried here, no extensive mortuary complex developed around it, as would be expected for a functioning royal tomb. This strongly suggests that Meidum was abandoned as a royal project before it could fulfill its intended purpose. The abandonment of Meidum was not the end of pyramid building. In fact, it was the beginning of something more refined. Sneferu went on to build two more pyramids at Dahshur, the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid. Each one reflects lessons learned from Meidum. The Bent Pyramid changes angle midway through construction, likely in response to structural instability. The Red Pyramid adopts a shallower angle from the start, resulting in the first truly successful smooth-sided pyramid in Egypt. In this way, Meidum was not a dead end, it was a test. The pyramid stands as physical evidence of trial and error on a monumental scale. Ancient Egyptian builders did not leap directly to perfection. They experimented, observed failure, and adjusted their approach accordingly. This is what makes Meidum so important. It shows that even in a civilization famous for precision and order, large-scale experimentation carried risk. Builders pushed boundaries, sometimes too far. When those boundaries failed, the response was not denial or myth-making, but adaptation. Standing at Meidum today, the debris field surrounding the pyramid tells a silent story. The fallen stones are not random. They show patterns of collapse, sliding outward in massive sheets rather than shattering, consistent with casing stones detaching from a weakened core. This supports the idea of structural failure, the Red Pyramid's emergency completion. If you stand before the Red Pyramid at Dahshur, it appears calm, stable, and confident, rising cleanly from the desert with a smooth triangular shape that feels resolved and final. It looks like a monument built with certainty, as if its builders knew exactly what they were doing from the very first stone. But this appearance is deceptive. The Red Pyramid is not the product of perfect planning. It is the result of urgent correction, rapid decision-making, and lessons learned under pressure. The Red Pyramid exists because something had already gone wrong. By the time construction began at Dashur, Pharaoh Sneferu had already experienced failure on a monumental scale. The Meidum Pyramid had collapsed, exposing the danger of converting step pyramids into smooth-sided forms without proper structural support. Determined to succeed, Sneferu ordered a new pyramid at Dashur, one that would finally realise the vision of a true pyramid. That pyramid was the bent pyramid. At first, the bent pyramid followed the same ambitious angle used at Meidum, rising steeply toward the sky. But partway through construction, something alarming became clear. Cracks began appearing in the inner chambers. Stress lines formed in the masonry. The structure was unstable. The angle was too steep, and the weight was becoming unmanageable. Faced with the possibility of another catastrophic failure, the builders made a dramatic decision. They changed the angle of the pyramid midway through construction, reducing the slope and giving the bent pyramid its distinctive shape. This adjustment likely prevented collapse, but it came at a cost. The bent pyramid was structurally compromised, and its long-term reliability as a royal tomb was uncertain. Sneferu needed another solution. The Red Pyramid was that solution, and it was built with urgency. Unlike earlier pyramids, the Red Pyramid was planned from the beginning with a much shallower angle, one that would distribute weight more safely down into the foundation. This change alone marks a critical moment in architectural understanding. The builders were no longer experimenting blindly. They were responding directly to structural evidence. But while the external shape of the Red Pyramid suggests confidence, the interior tells a different story. Inside the pyramid, the corridors and chambers are rough, uneven, and unfinished in places. Stone blocks are less carefully dressed. The walls lack the refined precision seen in later monuments. There is a noticeable difference between the exterior casing and the internal construction, suggesting speed was a priority. This is where the idea of emergency completion becomes important. The Red Pyramid appears to have been completed quickly, possibly faster than originally planned, to ensure Sneferu had a stable burial monument within his lifetime. Unlike later pharaohs, who could rely on established methods, Sneferu was navigating uncharted territory. His reign became a period of architectural trial under real political pressure. A king without a tomb was vulnerable. Royal burial was not just symbolic, it was essential to cosmic order, legitimacy, and continuity. Failing to secure a functional pyramid before death was unthinkable. The urgency behind the Red Pyramid's completion likely explains the rough interior workmanship. Precision gave way to reliability. Function became more important than refinement. The chambers inside the Red Pyramid are corbelled, with layers of stone stacked inward to distribute weight. This technique was known, but here it is applied conservatively, reinforcing stability rather than elegance. The builders were clearly prioritizing structural safety over aesthetic perfection. This shift in priorities is deeply human. The Red Pyramid is not the monument of a civilization at ease. It is the monument of a civilization learning in real time. Every rough stone inside reflects a decision made under pressure, a compromise between ideal design and practical necessity. Despite the rushed interior, the Red Pyramid succeeded. It did not collapse. It did not crack. It stood. This success marked a turning point in Egyptian architecture. For the first time, a smooth-sided pyramid was completed and remained structurally sound. The builders had finally solved the fundamental problem that had plagued earlier attempts. The lessons learned here directly influenced the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza. The shallower angle, the emphasis on stable foundations, and the careful management of internal stress all appear again, refined and perfected. In this sense, the Red Pyramid is the quiet hero of pyramid history. It does not inspire awe through size or polish. It inspires understanding. It shows us the moment when experimentation gave way to confidence, when survival mattered more than display. Standing inside the Red Pyramid today, the roughness of the stone is impossible to ignore. The walls feel closer, the surfaces feel unfinished. Yet this rawness is exactly what makes the structure honest. It reflects a moment when ancient builders chose safety over symbolism, completion over perfection. The Red Pyramid was not built to impress future generations. It was built to work. That is why it matters. As chapter 5 in this journey, the Red Pyramid's emergency completion fits naturally alongside the cracked obelisks and abandoned pyramids that came before it. Together, they tell a story rarely emphasized in popular history, that progress is often born from correction, not certainty. The Red Pyramid stands today not as a flawless monument, but as a successful one. It proves that ancient Egypt's greatest achievement was not its monuments alone, but its ability to learn, adapt, and move forward after failure. And in the quiet interior of the Red Pyramid, surrounded by rough stone laid in haste, we can still sense the urgency of that moment, a civilization racing not toward glory but towards stability. That urgency worked, and because it did, everything that followed became possible. The tomb with blank walls. Deep in the Valley of the Kings, beyond the decorated corridors that usually define royal burials, there are tombs that feel strangely incomplete. Their walls are rough, their surfaces are uneven, the plaster is unfinished, and in some chambers the stone has never been smoothed at all. No painted gods line the passages, no spells from the Book of the Dead cover the walls, no names declare who was meant to rest there. These are the tombs with blank walls, and they reveal a side of ancient Egypt that polished monuments rarely show. The Valley of the Kings was not a single project, but a working landscape. For centuries, it functioned like an underground construction zone, where teams of craftsmen carved tombs continuously for reigning pharaohs. Each tomb began as a practical necessity, not a finished artwork. Decoration came later. What mattered first was excavation. A king's tomb was never guaranteed to reach completion. Unlike pyramids, which were visible projects built over decades, tombs in the Valley of the Kings were hidden underground, carved directly into limestone cliffs. Work often began shortly after a pharaoh came to power, but death did not wait for completion. If a king died early, construction stopped immediately, and whatever had been carved had to be adapted for burial. This is where the blank walls appear. Some tombs show signs of having progressed deep into the rock, with corridors, chambers, and even burial halls fully cut, yet their walls remain untouched by decoration. In others, only a few chambers were finished, while deeper sections remain rough, abandoned mid-work. These tombs were not forgotten projects. They were used. The absence of decoration does not mean abandonment. It means urgency. Ancient Egyptian burial beliefs placed enormous importance on preparation for the afterlife, but practicality still mattered. A body had to be buried quickly. Rituals had to be performed. The king had to be placed in the ground before decay or disorder disrupted cosmic balance. When time ran out, decoration became secondary. Standing inside one of these unfinished tombs today, the difference is immediately noticeable. The walls are uneven, tool marks remain visible, the ceiling feels closer, the space feels more functional than symbolic. This is not the Egypt of textbooks and museum halls. This is Egypt under pressure. The workers who carved these tombs were highly skilled. They knew exactly how the walls should look when finished. The roughness is not incompetence, it is interruption. Some tombs were clearly repurposed. If a reigning king died suddenly, an unfinished tomb originally intended for someone else might be adapted quickly. Names could be changed later. Decoration might be added hastily, or not at all. In some cases, plaster was applied to smooth the walls, but painting never followed. The result is silence in stone. Blank walls tell us that ancient Egypt did not always have the fee luxury of time. Royal death could disrupt schedules, resources, and labour plans instantly. A tomb that was meant to take decades might need to serve its purpose within months. This reality contrasts sharply with the popular image of ancient Egypt as a civilization of endless patience and timeless construction. In truth, it was a society that had to react quickly to unpredictable events, just like any other. The Valley of the Kings was not a place of perfection, it was a place of adaptation. The unfinished tombs also revealed a sequence of work. First came excavation, then smoothing, then plaster, then painting, then inscriptions. When a tomb lacks decoration, it tells us exactly where the process stopped. These walls act like frozen timelines. Some blank walls show faint guidelines, red lines sketched by artists planning scenes that were never painted. Others show partial plaster layers, applied but never finished. In a few cases, a single wall might be decorated while the rest remain bare, suggesting work began but was cut short abruptly. These details humanize the site. They tell us that craftsmen were preparing designs, planning scenes, and expecting to return the next day. Then something changed. A death occurred. Orders shifted. The work ended. Unlike modern construction sites, ancient tombs were not reopened once burial took place. Sealing the tomb was part of the ritual. Once sealed, unfinished walls remained unfinished forever. This gives the blank walls their power. They are not artistic choices. They are moments of interruption preserved for thousands of years. Some of these tombs belong to lesser-known kings or rulers with short reigns. Others may have been intended for powerful individuals who simply ran out of time. Without inscriptions, identifying their owners becomes difficult, which adds to the sense of anonymity. A tomb without decoration has no voice, yet this silence speaks volumes. It tells us that ancient Egyptian religion, while deeply symbolic, was also flexible. A perfect tomb was ideal, but an incomplete one was acceptable if rituals could still be performed. Belief systems adapted to reality rather than collapsing under it. The afterlife did not require artistic perfection, it required order. The blank walls also challenged the idea that decoration was always essential for salvation. While texts and images guided the deceased through the afterlife, their absence did not prevent burial. This suggests that ritual action and placement mattered more than visual completeness. In some cases, substitute rituals may have been performed elsewhere. In others, the king's identity may have been protected through objects rather than walls. Coffins, amulets, and burial goods could compensate for undecorated stone. What remains undeniable is that these tombs were used, sealed, and respected. They were not failures, they were solutions. As a chapter in this series, the tomb with blank walls fits naturally alongside them. Abandoned pyramids and cracked obelisks, all of them represent moments when ancient builders adjusted expectations in response to reality. They show that Egypt's greatness was not built on perfection alone, but on the ability to respond when plans changed. Walking through an unfinished tomb today feels different from visiting a decorated one. There is no visual narrative guiding the eye, no gods watching from the walls, just stone, shadow, and the sense of work left incomplete. That incompleteness makes the space feel closer to the people who built it. The tomb of Tutankhamun, rushed and small. When people think of Tutankhamun, they think of gold, masks, coffins, jewellery, shrines stacked within shrines. His name has become inseparable from wealth and spectacle. Yet beneath all of that brilliance lies a quiet contradiction that archaeology cannot ignore. Tutankhamun, the most famous pharaoh in the world today, was buried in one of the smallest and most hastily prepared royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The tomb itself, known as KV62, is not impressive by royal standards. It is short, narrow, and unusually simple. It consists of only a few chambers, carved shallowly into the limestone, with little architectural ambition. Compared to the long corridors and deep burial halls of other kings, Tutankhamun's tomb feels almost provisional, as if it was never meant to be permanent. That feeling is accurate. Tutankhamun came to the throne as a child, likely around 9 years old, during a time of political and religious instability. His reign lasted only about 9 years. When he died, he was still a teenager. His death was sudden, and the state was unprepared. A pharaoh without a tomb was a crisis. Royal burial in ancient Egypt was not optional or symbolic. It was essential for cosmic balance, for the continuation of kingship, and for the stability of the state itself. The death of a king triggered an immediate race against time. The body had to be preserved, rituals had to be completed, a burial place had to be secured, regardless of readiness. Tutankhamun did not have the luxury of a grand, long-planned tomb. Archaeological evidence strongly suggests that KV62 was not originally intended for him at all. Its size, layout, and orientation are more consistent with tombs built for high-ranking officials or queens rather than kings. Many scholars believe the tomb was repurposed quickly after Tutankhamun's death, adapted under extreme pressure to serve as a royal burial. The walls of the tomb tell this story clearly. Unlike other royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the decoration in Tutankhamun's tomb is minimal and uneven. Only one chamber, the burial chamber itself, bears painted scenes, and even these are rushed. The figures are simpler, the colours flatter, and the composition lacks the refinement seen in earlier or later royal tombs. Some walls were plastered and painted hastily, covering rough stone beneath. Others were left unfinished entirely. The painters worked quickly, prioritising ritual necessity over artistic perfection. This is not carelessness, it is urgency. The burial chamber scenes depict Tutankhamun's journey into the afterlife, his transformation into Osiris, and his acceptance among the gods. These images were essential, not decorative. They had to be present for the rituals to function correctly. Everything else could wait, but waiting was not an option. Even the placement of objects inside the tomb reflects haste. When Howard Carter opened KV62 in 1922, he found the chambers packed tightly with goods, stacked and wedged wherever space allowed. There was little order. Chariots leaned against walls. Furniture overlapped. Shrines barely fit inside the burial chamber. This was not the result of looting or disturbance. This was how the tomb was sealed. The sheer quantity of grave goods contrasts sharply with the small size of the tomb, reinforcing the idea that the burial was improvised. The objects prepared for Tutankhamun were fit for a king, but the space meant to hold them was not. Even the sarcophagus itself appears to have been adapted. The stone box barely fits inside the burial chamber, leaving minimal space around it. The nested coffins inside show signs of modification, suggesting adjustments were made late in the process to accommodate what was available rather than what was ideal. Tutankhamun's burial was not planned, it was managed. The political context helps explain this. Tutankhamun ruled during the aftermath of the Amarna period, when his predecessor Akhenaten had disrupted traditional religion by promoting the worship of a single god, Aten. After Akhenaten's death, the state rushed to restore traditional beliefs, temples, and priesthoods. Tutankhamun himself became a symbol of restoration, even though he was young and likely had little personal control over policy. His death threatened to destabilize that fragile recovery. A smooth burial was critical. The people responsible for Tutankhamun's burial were under immense pressure. They had to honour tradition, satisfy the priesthood, and maintain continuity, all while working with limited time and an unsuitable tomb. The result was KV62. From an archaeological perspective, the tomb's small size and rushed decoration explain why it survived largely intact. Larger, more prominent tombs were looted repeatedly in antiquity. Tutankhamun's modest tomb, hidden beneath debris from later constructions, escaped attention. Ironically, its inadequacy protected it. The unfinished walls also provide rare insight into the sequence of tomb decoration. We can see where plaster was applied quickly, where sketches were simplified, and where artists stopped abruptly. These details show us how royal tombs were normally completed, by showing us what happens when they are not. Tutankhamun's tomb was sealed before perfection could be achieved. That fact humanizes the story. This was not a carefully staged eternity. It was a response to an unexpected death. People worked long hours underground, painting, plastering, carrying objects, sealing chambers, knowing they could not delay. Standing inside the burial chamber today, the walls feel close, the space feels compressed. There is no grand procession of corridors leading into darkness. There is only the sense of a job finished just in time. This does not diminish Tutankhamun's importance, it explains it. His tomb reflects the reality of ancient Egypt more honestly than our many grand monuments. It shows that even kings were subject to time, chance, and limitation. Eternity had deadlines. Tutankhamun did not receive the tomb he would have planned for himself. He received the tomb that circumstance allowed, and yet that rushed and small tomb preserved his legacy better than any perfect monument could have. Because it remained sealed, untouched and hidden, it carried his story intact into the modern world. Nefertari's missing burial treasures. When visitors enter the tomb of Queen Nefertari in the Valley of the Queens, the first reaction is usually silence, not because the space is empty, but because the walls are overwhelming. Every surface is covered with colour, symbols, gods, and texts, painted with a level of refinement rarely matched anywhere in ancient Egypt. This tomb is often described as the most beautiful in the entire Nile Valley. And yet, despite all this visual richness, something crucial is missing. Nefertari's burial treasures are gone. Queen Nefertari was the great royal wife of Ramesses II, one of the most powerful pharaohs Egypt ever produced. Her status was exceptional. In inscriptions, Ramesses II called her the one for whom the sun shines, a phrase that speaks not only of affection, but of political and religious importance. A queen of this rank would have been buried with extraordinary wealth, but when archaeologists entered her tomb, they found almost nothing. The tomb, known as KV66, is relatively large and carefully planned, with multiple chambers carved into the limestone hillside. Unlike rushed or unfinished tombs, this one was clearly prepared in advance. The walls are fully plastered and painted, the ceilings detailed, the corridors carefully proportioned. This was not an emergency burial, and yet the burial goods that should have filled these chambers were almost entirely absent. What remains today are fragments, a few pieces of a granite sarcophagus, broken Shabti figurines, small decorative elements scattered on the floor. The grand assemblage that must once have been here is gone, removed long before modern archaeology arrived. This absence raises a difficult question. If Nefertari was buried with wealth befitting her status, where did it all go? The most straightforward answer is looting, and there is little doubt that the tomb was entered in antiquity. Evidence of forced entry and disturbance is present. Ancient tomb robbing was widespread, driven by economic pressure, corruption, and opportunity. Even royal tombs were not safe, but looting alone does not fully explain what we see here. The tomb walls are remarkably well preserved. Unlike many looted tombs, the paintings were not systematically damaged or destroyed. This suggests that robbers were focused on portable wealth, not symbolic destruction. They took what could be carried and left what could not. Yet even accounting for looting, the scale of absence feels disproportionate. For a queen of Nefertari's status, we would expect to find traces of elaborate coffins, gold fittings, jewellery fragments, and ritual equipment. Instead, the tomb feels stripped almost completely bare. It is as if the burial was dismantled rather than simply robbed. One possibility is that Nefertari's burial was moved. In later periods of Egyptian history, royal and elite mummies were often relocated to protect them from tomb robbers. Coffins and grave goods were transferred to caches, reburied or reused. It is possible that Nefertari's remains and treasures were removed deliberately by priests rather than thieves. If this is the case, the removal would have been orderly rather than chaotic, which might explain the lack of widespread damage. Another possibility is that the tomb was entered repeatedly over time. Early robbers may have taken the most obvious valuables, while later intrusions removed what remained. Over centuries, even fragments could disappear. Still, the emptiness of the tomb stands in contrast to its visual richness. Nefertari's tomb feels like a stage without actors, a script without performers. The walls show her moving confidently through the afterlife, guided by gods, reciting spells, and achieving transformation. Everything needed for eternal life is depicted in perfect detail. Everything except the physical objects meant to accompany her. This contrast reveals something important about ancient Egyptian belief. The images on the walls were not decoration, they were functional. They served as magical substitutes for rituals and objects. Even if physical items were lost, the spells and scenes remained active. In Egyptian belief, representation could replace reality. This means that even stripped of its treasures, the tomb still worked. The walls themselves ensured Nefertari's passage into the afterlife. From a human perspective, this realization is striking. The builders invested enormous effort into the tomb's imagery, knowing that physical goods could be stolen, damaged, or removed. The painted walls were permanent in a way that gold was not. In this sense, Nefertari's tomb reflects foresight. The missing treasures also tell us about vulnerability. No matter how powerful the individual, burial goods were never truly secure. Tomb robbing was not a marginal crime. It was a systemic issue, often involving officials, guards and priests. This reality forces us to see ancient Egypt less as a static, perfect civilization and more as a living society with economic pressure, corruption and survival instincts. Someone took Nefertari's treasures not because they rejected her importance, but because those objects had value in a changing world. Standing in KV66 today, the absence is almost as powerful as the art. Visitors imagine what once filled the chambers, but the emptiness draws attention back to the walls, to the texts, to the beliefs that mattered most. Nefertari's physical wealth is gone, but her identity remains intact. As chapter 8 in this series, her tomb fits naturally with abandoned pyramids, rushed burials, and blank walls. It shows another way ancient plans were disrupted, not by structural failure or time pressure, but by human intervention long after burial. The tomb was finished, the burial was complete, but history did not stop there. What happened after mattered just as much. Nefertari's missing treasures remind us that ancient monuments are not frozen moments. They are part of long stories that include reuse, loss, and reinterpretation. The past does not remain untouched simply because it is sacred. And yet, despite everything that was taken, the tomb still speaks. The colours remain vivid. The gods still stand on the walls. Nefertari still walks into eternity. Her gold is gone. Her story is not. And sometimes that imbalance tells us more about the ancient world than any intact treasure ever could. The lost tombs of the pyramid builders. When people stand before the pyramids of Giza, their attention is drawn upward, toward the massive stones, the perfect geometry, and the overwhelming presence of monuments built for kings. For centuries, the question has always been how the pyramids were built, what tools were used, and whether such structures were even possible for ancient people. But for a long time, a far more important question went unanswered. Who were the people who actually built them, and where did they go when they died? For generations, pyramid builders were imagined as nameless labourers, slaves driven by force, worked until death, and discarded without recognition. This image persisted not because of evidence, but because their graves were missing. The kings had pyramids, the nobles had mastabas, but the builders themselves seemed to have vanished from history. That absence was not accidental. Their tombs were simply overlooked. South of the Great Pyramid, beyond the ceremonial core of Giza, archaeologists eventually began to uncover something unexpected. Not palaces or temples, but cemeteries, rows of modest tombs carved into the rock, arranged with care, positioned deliberately close to the monuments they helped create. These were not royal burials, they belonged to the workers. The discovery changed everything. The tombs of the pyramid builders are simple compared to those of kings, but they are far from insignificant. They consist of small mastabas, shaft graves, and rock-cut chambers, often grouped together in organised rows. Their placement is crucial. They were buried in the shadow of the pyramids, a privilege never granted to slaves. In ancient Egypt, burial location mattered. Only individuals considered essential to the king's eternal project were allowed to rest near royal monuments. These tombs were not hidden or discarded. They were intentionally placed within sacred space. Inside the tombs, archaeologists found evidence of identity, inscriptions naming individuals, titles describing professions, references to work gangs, crews and teams with names that reflected pride and organisation. These were not anonymous labourers. They were skilled workers who belonged to structured groups. Some tombs belonged to overseers, stonemasons, planners and craftsmen. Others belonged to labourers who transported blocks, prepared ramps and maintained tools. Together they formed a workforce that was organised, trained and respected. The bodies themselves tell an even deeper story. Skeletal analysis shows that these workers suffered from arthritis, joint stress and muscle wear consistent with heavy labour. Many had healed fractures, suggesting access to medical care, broken bones that had been set properly, signs of treatment, and these people were not disposable, they were supported. Their diet reinforces this. Remains of bread, beer, meat and fish found near worker settlements indicate a high-calorie diet designed to sustain intense physical labour. This was state-sponsored nourishment, not survival scraps. The pyramid builders were fed, housed and buried by the state. This reality dismantles the idea of pyramid construction as slave labour. Slaves were not buried with honour, named in tombs, or given medical treatment. These workers were part of a national project, likely serving in rotating crews, contributing labour as a form of duty and pride. The tombs also reveal a social hierarchy. Not all builders were equal. Some had larger tombs, inscriptions, and better burial goods. These were likely supervisors and specialists. Others had simpler graves, but still received burial rites. This reflects a structured workforce, not chaos. One of the most humanizing aspects of these tombs is their proximity to one another. Families may have been buried together. Co-workers rested side by side. These were communities, not faceless masses. For thousands of years their contributions were overshadowed by the monuments they built. The pyramids stood, the kings were remembered, the builders remained invisible, until archaeology shifted its focus. The lost tombs of the pyramid builders remind us that great monuments are never the work of a single ruler. They are the result of collective effort, planning, endurance, and skill. The pyramids were not miracles. They were projects carried out by people with names, injuries, families, and lives beyond the stones they lifted. Standing at Giza today, it is easy to feel dwarfed by scale. But when you stand among the workers' tombs, the perspective changes. The pyramids stop feeling distant and start feeling human. These tombs do not glorify suffering. They record contribution. The builders were not buried like kings, but they were not erased. Their resting places show that ancient Egypt recognized the value of labor and honored it within its own system of belief. This does not mean their lives were easy. The work was brutal, the environment was harsh, injuries were common, but the system did not treat them as expendable. They were part of something larger, and they were remembered for it. The pharaoh, who ruled for only months. In the long history of ancient Egypt, most pharaohs left behind something tangible: a monument, a tomb, an inscription, a name carved deeply into stone. Even rulers who failed or were unpopular usually left traces that archaeologists could follow. But there is one pharaoh whose reign passed so quickly and so quietly that history almost lost him entirely. His name was Smenkhkare, and his time on the throne may have lasted only a few months. Smenkhkare emerges from history like a shadow, visible only at certain angles and gone the moment you try to look directly at him. He ruled during one of the most chaotic periods Egypt ever experienced, the final years of the Amarna Age, when religion, politics, and royal identity were all in flux. Understanding his reign means entering a moment where certainty disappears and survival mattered more than permanence. The Amarna period began under Akhenaten, the pharaoh who attempted to reshape Egyptian religion around the worship of a single god, the Aten. Temples were closed, traditional gods were sidelined, and a new capital city, Akhetaten, was built in the desert. This radical shift disrupted centuries of tradition and weakened the balance between the throne, the priesthood, and the people. By the time Akhenaten's reign was nearing its end, Egypt was unstable. Foreign policy had suffered. Internal administration was strained. Religious unity had fractured. The royal family itself became difficult to track, with overlapping names, titles, and identities that still confuse scholars today. It is within this uncertainty that Smenkhkare appears. Very little is known about his origins. He may have been a younger brother, a son, or even a close relative by marriage. Some scholars believe he was married to Meritaten, Akhenaten's eldest daughter, which would have strengthened his claim to the throne. Others suggest he may have served as a co-regent toward the end of Akhenaten's reign. What is clear is that Smenkhkare existed, but briefly. His name appears in only a handful of inscriptions and reliefs, mostly from Amarna. In these scenes he is shown wearing royal regalia, sometimes alongside Akhenaten, sometimes alone. His titles identify him as king, not prince, yet the scarcity of evidence suggests his reign was extremely short, possibly only months. There are no large monuments bearing his name, no completed temples, no clear tomb, no long inscriptions celebrating victories or jubilees. His presence in the archaeological record is faint, almost accidental. This absence is not because Smenkhkare was unimportant, it is because there was no time. The transition from Akhenaten to the next stable ruler was chaotic. Power may have shifted rapidly behind palace walls. Decisions were likely made in secrecy. The state needed continuity, not experimentation. If Smenkhkare ruled alone, it was during a moment of emergency. Egypt needed a king immediately after Akhenaten's death, but it also needed someone acceptable to competing factions: the Aten priesthood, traditional religious authorities, the military, and the bureaucracy. Smenkhkare may have been a compromise candidate, elevated quickly and removed just as quickly when circumstances changed. There is also the possibility that Smenkhkare died unexpectedly. A sudden death would explain the lack of preparation, the absence of a grand burial, and the rapid transition to Tutankhamun, who ascended the throne soon after and began restoring traditional religion. If Smenkhkare ruled briefly and died young, the state may have chosen not to emphasize his reign, focusing instead on stability. This would explain why his name was not aggressively erased but quietly ignored. In Egyptian history, damnation was loud, forgetting was quiet. Smenkhkare was not subjected to systematic erasure like Akhenaten. His name appears, but sparsely. This suggests indifference rather than hostility. He was not blamed, he was bypassed. The confusion deepens when examining royal iconography. Some images once attributed to Akhenaten may depict Smenkhkare instead. The artistic style of Amarna blurs distinctions, making identification difficult. Faces are elongated, bodies stylized, features shared. This ambiguity mirrors the political reality of the time. Identity was unstable. Even Smenkhkare's burial is uncertain. Some scholars propose that a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, possibly KV55, may have been intended for him or reused for multiple individuals. The remains found there have been the subject of decades of debate, with DNA, age estimates, and inscriptions offering conflicting clues. Nothing about Smenkhkare is straightforward. This uncertainty has led to speculation, but speculation is not evidence. What matters is what the silence itself tells us. A reign measured in months leaves little archaeological footprint. Royal building projects took years. Religious reforms took generations. Smenkhkare had neither time nor stability. His role may have been transitional, holding the throne just long enough to prevent chaos. In human terms, Smenkhkare may have been placed in an impossible position. He inherited a fractured state, unresolved religious conflict, and the expectations of kingship without the time needed to fulfill them. His reign was not meant to last. It was meant to bridge a gap, and bridges are rarely remembered. Standing in the ruins of Amarna today, there are moments where names appear briefly, then vanish. Smenkhkare's name is one of them, a reminder that not all rulers shape history. Some merely pass through it. The pharaoh who ruled for only months reminds us that power is fragile. Even in ancient Egypt, where kings were divine, time could erase a reign before it had a chance to solidify. Smenkhkare did not fail to build monuments. He failed to outlast circumstance. And in that quiet disappearance, he reveals a truth that history often hides, that survival, not greatness, sometimes defines leadership. His reign ended almost as soon as it began, but the questions it left behind still remain, and sometimes those questions tell us more than certainty ever could. The secret star, maps inside, coffins, ancient Egyptian coffin ceilings, and the path to the afterlife. When archaeologists first began opening ancient Egyptian coffins, their attention was naturally drawn to the bodies, the amulets, and the inscriptions meant to protect the dead. For a long time, what lay directly above the deceased often went unnoticed. It was only when researchers began carefully studying the interiors of coffins that something unexpected emerged. Painted across the inside surfaces, especially on the lids and ceilings, were stars. Not decorative patterns, but deliberate arrangements. Maps. These were not meant to be seen by the living. The star maps inside Egyptian coffins were created for one purpose only: to guide the dead. In ancient Egypt, death was not an end. It was a journey, and like any journey, it required orientation. The soul needed direction, timing, and knowledge of the landscape it was about to enter. The night sky provided that structure. For the Egyptians, the stars were not distant objects. They were destinations. Some coffins, particularly from the Middle Kingdom, contain carefully painted star charts arranged in straight lines, grids, or diagonal patterns. These are now known as diagonal star clocks. At first glance, they appear abstract, but when studied closely, they reveal a precise system for tracking time during the night using the rising and setting of specific stars. This knowledge was not common, it was specialized, and it was hidden. The stars painted inside coffins correspond to deacons, groups of stars that rise sequentially throughout the night. By observing which decan rose at which hour, Egyptian astronomer priests could tell time without mechanical instruments. This system was practical, but inside a coffin it became symbolic. The dead needed to know when to move. The afterlife, as imagined by the Egyptians, was not timeless chaos. It followed cycles just like the world of the living. The sun god Ra travelled through the underworld each night. The deceased king or noble was expected to follow, navigating dangers, gates, and transformations before being reborn with the dawn. The stars were signposts along that route. Inside the coffin, the deceased lay beneath a painted sky, positioned as if already aligned with the cosmos. The orientation of the body, the placement of the stars, and the texts accompanying them all worked together to place the individual within the eternal rhythm of the universe. This was not decoration, it was instruction. What makes these star maps especially remarkable is their precision. The arrangement of stars follows astronomical logic rather than artistic symmetry. The spacing reflects rising times. The sequences reflect actual celestial motion. These were not imagined heavens, they were observed skies. The knowledge required to create these maps was held by a small group of specialists. Astronomer priests spent years studying the sky, recording patterns, and memorizing cycles. This information was sacred, not because it was mystical, but because it was powerful. Timekeeping meant control over ritual. Ritual meant access to eternity. By placing this knowledge inside coffins, the Egyptians ensured that the dead carried it with them. The coffin became more than a container for the body. It became a vehicle, a map, and a protective structure all at once. Not all coffins contain star maps. Their presence often correlates with status and period. During the Middle Kingdom, this practice became more widespread, extending beyond kings to high officials and elites. This shift reflects a democratization of the afterlife, where cosmic knowledge was no longer reserved solely for royalty, yet the knowledge was still restricted. The maps were never displayed openly in temples or public spaces. They were hidden inside coffins, sealed away forever. The living were not meant to study them. Only the dead needed them. This secrecy tells us something important about Egyptian belief. The afterlife was not vague or abstract. It was structured, timed, and navigable. The Egyptians believed that survival after death depended on preparation, knowledge, and alignment with cosmic order. The stars provided that order. Some coffins even include texts that refer directly to becoming a star. The deceased hoped to join the imperishable ones, the circumpolar stars that never set and never die. These stars circled the north forever, symbolizing eternal existence. To become one of them was the ultimate goal. The star maps were guides toward that transformation. From a human perspective, there is something deeply moving about this practice. Someone took the time to paint the night sky inside a coffin, knowing it would never be seen again. The work was done with care, accuracy, and intention, even though no living eye would ever admire it. This was belief made tangible. It also reveals how closely science and spirituality were intertwined in ancient Egypt. Astronomy was not separate from religion. Observing the sky was a sacred act. Measuring time was a form of devotion. Understanding celestial cycles meant understanding divine order. Modern categories do not apply here. There was no division between science and belief. The star maps inside coffins represent one of the earliest known attempts to encode astronomical knowledge visually. They predate many later star charts and reflect an observational tradition that lasted for centuries. Yet for a long time, they were misunderstood or dismissed as decoration. Only careful study revealed their purpose. The positioning of stars on coffin lids often aligns with the orientation of the tomb. The north-south axis mattered. The body was placed to mirror cosmic alignment. Everything was intentional. Even the act of sealing the coffin had meaning. Once closed, The star map was complete. The deceased was enclosed within the universe itself, wrapped in cosmic order. This transforms how we understand Egyptian coffins. They were not boxes, they were cosmological devices. The Egyptians did not need future generations to understand these maps. They needed the dead to understand them. That difference matters. Standing in a museum today, looking at the interior of an ancient coffin, we are witnessing something never meant for us. A private guide, sealed away thousands of years ago, now exposed to modern eyes. And yet, the intention remains clear. The dead were not sent blindly into darkness. They were sent with a map drawn from the stars themselves, painted quietly inside wood and stone, meant to guide a soul through the night and into eternity. In that silent hidden sky, ancient Egypt placed one of its deepest truths, that even in death, order mattered, time mattered, and the universe was not something to fear, but something to follow. The Saqqara animal, catacombs mystery. At the edge of the Saqqara plateau, not far from pyramids built for kings, there is another underground world that most visitors never see. It does not honour pharaohs, queens, or nobles. Instead, its corridors were cut for animals, millions of them, wrapped, sealed, stacked, and buried beneath the desert in darkness. These are the Saqqara animal catacombs, and they represent one of the largest and most puzzling burial practices in the ancient world. Descending into these catacombs feels unlike entering a royal tomb. The air is heavier, the tunnels are narrower, the silence is different. Where royal tombs feel ceremonial, these spaces feel industrial. Long passageways stretch into darkness, lined with niches and chambers once filled with animal mummies. Cats, dogs, ibises, baboons, falcons, bulls and more. Each species associated with a specific god. The scale is difficult to comprehend. Archaeological estimates suggest that millions of animals were buried here over centuries. Not dozens, not hundreds. Entire populations were bred, killed, mummified, and interred as part of a system that operated continuously across generations. This was not random devotion, it was organised. In ancient Egypt, animals were not simply creatures. Many were living symbols of divine forces. Cats were linked to Bastet, ibises to Thoth, falcons to Horus, bulls to Apis. Offering an animal to a god was a way of communicating with the divine, asking for protection, healing, or favour. But what happened at Saqqara goes far beyond simple offerings. The catacombs reveal a mass production system. Animals were bred specifically for sacrifice. Many were killed young. Some were poorly mummified, wrapped hastily, or placed into collective burial pits rather than individual containers. This suggests volume mattered more than care. This creates a tension. On one hand, these animals were sacred. On the other, they were commodities. This contradiction sits at the heart of the Saqqara mystery. Why did ancient Egyptians invest enormous resources into burying animals in such quantities? The answer lies in economics, belief, and human behaviour intersecting in uncomfortable ways. Pilgrims travelled to Saqqara to make offerings. Priests managed the cults. Breeders supplied animals. Embalmers prepared mummies. Vendors sold votive offerings. The animal cult supported an entire economy. A cat mummy was not just a religious object, it was a transaction. For ordinary people, offering a mummified animal was a way to participate in religion without access to monumental architecture or royal rituals. It was personal, affordable, and tangible. The gods could be approached through these small sacrifices. As demand increased, supply followed. The catacombs expanded not because belief intensified, but because systems scaled. The process became standardized. Some mummies were carefully prepared. Others were symbolic bundles containing only bones, feathers, or even empty wrappings. This does not mean belief was fake. It means belief adapted to reality. Excavations inside the Saqqara catacombs reveal something unsettling. Many animal remains show signs of deliberate killing, neck breaks, blunt force trauma, rapid slaughter. These animals were not pets that died naturally. They were offerings produced efficiently. This forces us to confront ancient religion not as something purely spiritual, but as something deeply human. It involved compromise, repetition, and sometimes cruelty justified by belief. The mystery deepens when we consider how these catacombs were sealed. Once filled, tunnels were closed, new ones carved, and the cycle continued. Over time, older sections were forgotten. Some collapsed, others were looted, still others remained untouched, preserving their contents in darkness. For centuries, this underground world grew larger than many cities above it. Unlike royal tombs, these spaces were never meant to be revisited. There were no inscriptions explaining meaning, no names to preserve memory. The animals were anonymous, yet their burial was deliberate. This suggests that the act itself mattered more than remembrance. The offering was complete once sealed. The god had received it. Human acknowledgement was no longer required. Standing in these tunnels today, surrounded by empty niches and broken wrappings, the scale becomes overwhelming. This was not occasional devotion. This was sustained, repetitive religious labour carried out across generations. The Saqqara animal catacombs reveal a side of ancient Egypt that is rarely romanticised. It is not about divine kings or perfect monuments. It is about systems, belief systems that needed maintenance, economic systems that grew around faith, human systems that balanced devotion with practicality. The animals were sacred, but they were also replaceable. This does not diminish ancient Egyptian religion. It makes it real. People needed gods. Gods needed offerings. Offerings needed supply. The result was one of the largest burial complexes on Earth, built not for humans, but for symbols. Today, many of the mummies are gone, destroyed by looting, decay, or even used as fertilizer in the 19th century. What remains are the tunnels, the emptiness, and the quiet evidence of scale. The mystery is not why Egyptians loved animals. The mystery is how belief transformed life into system. The Saqqara catacombs force us to see religion as lived experience, shaped by economics, population, and time. They remind us that ancient faith was not static or idealized. It was practiced daily by millions of ordinary people seeking meaning in an uncertain world. These animal burials were not about the animals themselves. They were about communication between humans and gods, between fear and hope, between life and order. And deep beneath the desert of Saqqara, that conversation still echoes, sealed into stone corridors that now once carried faith by the millions. The pharaoh whose body was never buried, missing royal mummies, and the limits of eternal order in ancient Egypt. In a civilization that built its entire belief system around death, burial, and eternal preservation, the absence of a body is not a small detail. It is a rupture. Ancient Egypt was obsessed with burial not because of fear, but because burial was the mechanism that allowed life to continue beyond death. The body mattered. Without it, eternity was impossible. And yet, in several cases we are faced with a disturbing reality. Pharaohs who ruled Egypt, whose names appear in records, whose monuments exist, but whose bodies were never found, never buried properly, or disappeared entirely. This is not an accident of archaeology alone. It is a contradiction within the system itself. To understand why a missing royal body matters so deeply, we need to understand what burial meant in ancient Egypt. Death was not an ending, but a transition. The body was the anchor that held the soul to the world. Without preservation, the Ka and Ba could not reunite. The afterlife depended on physical continuity. For a pharaoh, this was even more critical. The king was divine. His burial was not only about his own survival, but about cosmic balance. A pharaoh who was not properly buried threatened order itself. And yet, history tells us that some kings vanished. In a few cases, tombs exist but are empty. In others, names survive, but no burial place has ever been identified. Some rulers appear briefly in king lists and then disappear completely, leaving behind no mummy, no confirmed tomb, and no clear explanation. One of the most troubling examples comes from periods of instability, when succession was unclear and power shifted rapidly. During such times, the machinery of burial could fail. Death did not wait for preparation. A king who died unexpectedly during rebellion, exile, or internal conflict may never have received the burial he was meant to have. His body could have been lost, destroyed, hidden, or deliberately denied ritual treatment. This possibility is uncomfortable because it suggests that even divine kings were vulnerable. The absence of a mummy is not always due to tomb robbery. In many cases, looters left bodies behind and took objects. Missing bodies point to something more fundamental: disruption at the moment of death. Consider rulers who reigned briefly or during religious upheaval. Their legitimacy may have been contested. Their burial rites may have been delayed, interrupted, or quietly abandoned. In extreme cases, their bodies may have been disposed of without ceremony to erase their claim. Ancient Egypt practiced damnatio memoriae, the erasure of memory, but burial denial was even more severe. To be unburied was to be unmade. This raises a chilling possibility. Some pharaohs were not just forgotten, they were intentionally excluded from eternity. The archaeological record hints at this through empty tombs, unfinished burial chambers, and royal monuments without corresponding mummies. The infrastructure exists, but the final act is missing. In some cases, bodies may have been reburied elsewhere, moved for protection during periods of widespread tomb robbery. Royal caches like Deir el-Bahari show that priests relocated mummies to save them. But even in these caches, some names are absent. Those absences matter. They suggest that not every king was saved. Some bodies were lost before rescue was possible. Others may never have been placed in tombs at all. There is also the possibility of death away from Egypt. A pharaoh who died during military campaign, diplomatic travel, or internal exile might never have returned. Without the body, the rituals could not proceed. The state may have performed symbolic rites in place of physical burial, but these were substitutions, not solutions. The system required a body. Without it, belief fractured. This tension reveals something rarely acknowledged. Ancient Egypt's funerary system was powerful, but not invincible. It depended on stability, time, and cooperation. When those failed, eternity failed with them. The missing body of a pharaoh represents a breakdown in the most sacred contract Egypt ever created. From a human perspective, this is deeply revealing. It shows that ancient Egyptians lived with uncertainty, even about death. They planned obsessively for burial because they knew how fragile it was. That obsession was not confidence, it was fear of failure. Standing before an empty royal tomb today, the silence is different. It does not feel looted, it feels unresolved. The walls wait for a body that never arrived. The space exists for a ritual that was never completed. These tombs are not monuments, they are interruptions. They remind us that power does not guarantee control over fate. Even pharaohs could die at the wrong time, in the wrong place, under the wrong circumstances. The king lists continued. Dynasties moved on. History absorbed the disruption, but the absence remains. As modern observers, we often focus on what survives: mummies, coffins, gold, inscriptions, but absence is evidence too. And in ancient Egypt, absence was catastrophic. A pharaoh whose body was never buried represents the ultimate failure of eternal order. Not because the king was unimportant, but because the system could not protect him. The missing royal bodies stand as quiet warnings from the past. They tell us that even the most elaborate beliefs are vulnerable to chaos. That eternity requires conditions. That ritual depends on reality. And when reality breaks, even gods can be denied their rest. The pharaohs were promised forever. Some never received it. And in that silence, ancient Egypt becomes human again. A civilization that believed fiercely, planned obsessively, and still sometimes failed. The purpose of false doors in tombs. In ancient Egyptian tombs, there is a feature that looks simple, almost decorative at first glance, yet carries one of the deepest meanings in their entire belief system. Carved into stone walls, often carefully framed and richly inscribed, these features resemble doors, but they do not open. They lead nowhere physically. They are known today as false doors, and to the ancient Egyptians, they were anything but false. A false door was not meant for the living to pass through. It was built for the dead. To understand why false doors existed, we must understand how the ancient Egyptians thought about life, death, and space. For them, death did not separate the living world from the afterlife completely. Instead, the two existed side by side, divided by boundaries that could be crossed under the right conditions. A tomb was not a sealed endpoint. It was a place of interaction. The false door marked that interaction. In Old Kingdom mastaba tombs and later burial structures, false doors were usually placed on the west wall, the direction associated with the setting sun and the realm of the dead. This placement was deliberate. The west was where life ended and transformation began. The false door stood exactly at that symbolic threshold. Physically, a false door is carved to resemble a doorway with jambs, lintels, and panels. Often, it is inscribed with the name and titles of the deceased, along with offering formulas and prayers. Sometimes the carving is shallow, sometimes deeply recessed, but always intentional. It was not decoration, it was architecture for the unseen. The ancient Egyptians believed that the ka, one of the spiritual components of a person, needed nourishment after death. Food offerings placed in the tomb were meant to sustain the ka, but the ka needed a way to access those offerings. The false door provided that access. Through the false door, the ka could move between worlds. When priests or family members brought food, drink, or incense into the tomb chapel, they would place offerings in front of the false door. They believed that the essence of the offering passed through the door to the deceased, even though the physical object remained behind. This made the false door a functional element of the tomb, not a symbolic one. Without it, offerings could not reach their intended recipient. The inscriptions carved into false doors reinforced this purpose. Offering formulas ask that bread, beer, meat, and other goods be provided for the ka of the deceased. The door itself often bears the image of the tomb owner standing or seated, as if ready to receive what is being given. In some cases, the false door is the only place where the deceased is depicted. This was not coincidence. The image anchored the soul to that location. The door became a focal point for ritual and memory. This practice reflects a broader Egyptian understanding of space. The tomb was divided into zones: the burial chamber below, where the body rested, and the chapel above, where the living could enter. The false door connected these zones across physical separation. It was a bridge. False doors also played a role in identity. Names were carved repeatedly into them because the name itself was essential for survival after death. To erase a name was to destroy the individual. The false door ensured the name remained visible and spoken. Each time an offering was made, the name was read aloud. Each time the name was spoken, existence continued. This is why false doors are often among the most carefully carved elements of a tomb. Even when walls were left plain or decoration was minimal, the false door was rarely neglected. It was the interface between worlds, and it had to work. The evolution of false doors over time reveals shifts in belief and practice. In the Old Kingdom, they were central features of elite tombs. Later, during the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom, their role changed, sometimes replaced by offering tables, statues, or painted doorways. But the concept remained the same. There had to be a point of passage. Even when false doors disappeared as architectural features, their function was preserved symbolically. Painted doorways, statues set into niches, and texts describing movement between worlds carried forward the same idea. This continuity shows that false doors were not optional. They were necessary. From a human perspective, false doors reveal how the Egyptians dealt with loss. They did not accept death as absolute separation. They built places where interaction could continue, even if only symbolically. A false door allowed the living to feel they were still providing care. It allowed the dead to remain present. Standing in front of a false door today, there is something quietly powerful about it. The stone is solid. It does not open. And yet, it was never meant to. Its purpose was not movement of bodies, but movement of meaning. The door worked whether or not anyone believed in it centuries later. This challenges modern assumptions about religion and architecture. We often think of religious structures as representations. For the Egyptians, they were mechanisms. If built correctly and maintained through ritual, they functioned. The false door functioned as long as offerings were made and names were spoken. When tomb cults declined, when families disappeared, when priests stopped visiting, the doors fell silent. Not because they failed, but because the system around them did. This silence does not diminish their importance, it highlights it. False doors remind us that ancient Egyptian tombs were not monuments to death. They were installations for continued existence. Every element had a purpose tied to survival. The door was not false, it was precise. As we study these carved thresholds today, we are looking at a belief system that refused to accept separation. A civilization that built permanence not just in stone, but in relationships between the living and the dead. The false door was where those relationships met. It marked a place where food became essence, where names became life, and where stone became passage. And in that quiet, immovable doorway, ancient Egypt placed one of its most enduring ideas, that death was not a wall, but a boundary meant to be crossed again and again. Why Egypt suddenly changed burial styles. For centuries, ancient Egyptians buried their dead in a way that was practical, familiar, and deeply rooted in tradition. Rectangular mud brick structures known as mastabas covered underground burial chambers, protecting the body and providing a place for offerings and remembrance. This system worked. It was stable, symbolic, and widely accepted. And then, almost abruptly, everything changed. Egypt began building pyramids. The shift from mastaba tombs to pyramids was not gradual decoration or simple architectural experimentation. It was a profound transformation in how Egyptians understood death, kingship, and the relationship between humans, gods, and the sky. The question is not just how pyramids were built, but why Egypt abandoned a burial style that had served it well for generations. The answer lies not in technology alone, but in belief. Early Egyptian burials were focused on continuity. The mastaba reflected the house of the living, a low structure meant to anchor the dead in familiar space. Beneath it, the burial chamber held the body. Above it, offerings sustained the soul. This model emphasized connection between the living community and the dead individual, but kings were not ordinary individuals. As Egyptian political power centralized, the role of the pharaoh changed. He was no longer just a ruler among others. He became the embodiment of divine order on earth. His death was not simply a personal transition, it was a cosmic event. The old burial system could no longer contain that meaning. The mastaba, grounded and horizontal, represented continuity with the earth. But the evolving idea of kingship demanded elevation. The king was increasingly associated with the sun god, with ascent, with the sky itself. Burial architecture had to reflect that transformation. The pyramid was the solution. The earliest attempt at this change can be seen in the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara. Rather than abandoning the mastaba entirely, the builders stacked multiple mastabas on top of one another, creating a structure that rose upward in stages. This was not an aesthetic choice, it was a conceptual one. The king was no longer meant to remain close to the ground, he was meant to rise. This change reflects a shift in afterlife belief. Earlier traditions emphasized the underworld as the destination of the dead. The new ideology increasingly emphasized the sky. The king would ascend to join the sun, the stars, and the gods above. The pyramid's shape reinforced this idea. Its sloping sides mirrored rays of sunlight. Its pointed apex directed attention upward. Even its geometry suggested motion rather than rest. The transition was not smooth. Early pyramids reveal uncertainty, experimentation, and correction. Builders struggled with angles, weight distribution, and stability. Meidum collapsed. The bent pyramid changed shape midway. The red pyramid sacrificed refinement for safety. These failures show that Egypt did not switch burial styles because it had perfected pyramid building. It switched because it believed it had to. The burial style changed before the engineering fully caught up. This is important because it shows that belief drove architecture, not the other way around. The concept of a king ascending to the heavens demanded a form that reached upward, even if the builders were still learning how to make it work. For non-royal Egyptians, mastabas continued. The change was initially reserved for kings. This distinction reinforces the idea that burial style reflected status and cosmic role. The pyramid was not a better tomb, it was a different kind of statement. It declared that the king's destiny was no longer shared with his people. As pyramid building matured, the separation became more pronounced. Royal tombs grew massive and isolated. The burial chamber sank deep within the structure. Access became restricted. The living no longer interacted directly with the burial space. This marks a shift in relationship. Earlier, tombs invited interaction. Later, royal tombs emphasized distance. The king moved beyond reach, both physically and spiritually. At the same time, religious texts evolved. Pyramid texts appear, carved inside royal burial chambers, filled with spells focused on ascension, flight, and transformation into celestial beings. The language is vertical, the imagery looks upward. This textual change mirrors the architectural one. Egypt did not abandon mastabas because they failed. It abandoned them because they no longer expressed what kingship had become. The pyramid also served a political function. Its scale projected authority beyond the grave. It required national coordination, resources, and labour. Building a pyramid demonstrated control over the land, the people, and time itself. A mastaba honoured continuity. A pyramid announced dominance. Yet even as pyramids rose, mastabas did not disappear. Officials, nobles, and workers continued to be buried in them. The old system remained valid for most people. The change was selective. This tells us that Egypt did not experience a cultural rupture. It experienced a recalibration. The burial style changed at the top first. Later, as royal burials moved away from pyramids into hidden rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the logic remained the same. The king's destiny was no longer communal. It was cosmic. Architecture adapted again. The pyramid phase was not the end. It was a chapter. Looking back, the sudden change from mastaba to pyramid feels dramatic because it reflects a shift in how power imagined itself. The king was no longer just preserving life after death. He was claiming the sky. This was not an artistic revolution, it was a theological one. The stone followed belief. As we stand among mastabas and pyramids today, the contrast is striking. One is low, broad and earthbound. The other is sharp, rising and unreachable. Together, they record a moment when Egypt redefined eternity. Burial styles changed because the story of kingship changed. Death did not mean return to the land, it meant ascent beyond it. And in that decision, ancient Egypt reshaped not only its tombs, but its understanding of life, power, and the afterlife itself. The mystery of Egypt's missing queens. Ancient Egypt is remembered through kings. Their names are carved into stone, their faces shaped in statues, their tombs studied and mapped in detail. But when we begin to ask a quieter question, where are the queens? The certainty fades quickly. For many of the most powerful women in Egyptian history, no confirmed tomb exists. Their bodies are missing, their burial places are unknown, and in a civilization obsessed with death and remembrance, that absence is striking. These queens were not invisible in life. They ruled beside pharaohs, acted as regents, commanded estates, performed sacred rituals, and in some cases governed the kingdom itself. Their names appear in inscriptions, their images appear on temple walls, yet when it comes to burial, many of them vanish. This is not coincidence, it is pattern. To understand why so many Egyptian queens are missing, we must first understand how burial reflected power, status, and changing ideology. Queens occupied a complicated position. They were essential to legitimacy, but rarely central to political narrative after death. The king was eternal. The queen was supportive. This hierarchy shaped burial practices in subtle but lasting ways. In the early periods of Egyptian history, queens were often buried near their husbands, sometimes in subsidiary tombs or smaller pyramids. These burials existed, but they were less monumental, less protected, and more vulnerable to destruction, looting, or later reuse. As dynasties changed, queens' tombs were often disturbed or dismantled to make way for new construction. Their names were not always preserved with the same care as kings. Later, during the New Kingdom, royal burial practices shifted again. Kings moved into hidden rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Queens were buried separately, in what we now call the Valley of the Queens. This separation was practical, but it also made queens' tombs easier to overlook. Many of these tombs were never finished, others were reused, some were stripped in antiquity and left anonymous. The result is silence. For some queens we know their names, titles and influence in life, but cannot say where they were buried. For others, even their mummies are unaccounted for, with no clear record of relocation or protection. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. Queens were not always prioritised in death. This does not mean they were disrespected. It means the system valued kingship above all else. Resources, labour and protection were directed first to the pharaoh. When times were unstable, queens' burials were more likely to be delayed, simplified, or disrupted. Sudden deaths made this worse. If a queen died unexpectedly or during political transition, her burial preparations may have been incomplete, her tomb might never have been fully carved, her burial might have been provisional, later generations may not have felt obligated to preserve her. Resting the place. This is especially true for queens whose sons did not rule. In Egypt, memory depended on continuity. A queen remembered by her son stood a better chance of preservation. A queen without political legacy could disappear quietly. There is also the issue of reuse. Tombs were valuable. In periods of scarcity, older tombs were reopened and repurposed. Names were erased. Burials were moved. queens' tombs, being smaller and less guarded, were easier targets. In some cases, queens' remains may have been moved into communal caches, stripped of identity to protect them from looting. If labels were lost, identification became impossible. This may explain why some female mummies remain unidentified today. Another factor is intentional erasure. While rare, some queens were associated with political or religious controversy. In such cases, memory could be altered deliberately. Their monuments might remain, but burial acknowledgement could be minimized or removed entirely. Erasure did not always mean destruction. Sometimes it meant neglect. Queens also occupied a paradoxical role in ideology. They were powerful as symbols, mothers, wives, divine intermediaries, but their power was relational. When the relationship ended, so did the emphasis. The tomb, which represented eternity, reflected that shift. Standing in the Valley of the Queens today, the imbalance is visible. A few tombs, like Nefertari's, are breathtaking. Most are damaged, unfinished, or anonymous. Names are missing, decorations stop abruptly. Some tombs were never used at all. These spaces feel interrupted. They suggest plans that were never completed, burials that were altered, and stories that were not considered essential to preserve. From a human perspective, this is revealing. Ancient Egypt planned obsessively for death, but planning did not guarantee outcome. Gender, power, succession, and stability all influenced who was remembered and who faded. Queens were central in life, but often peripheral in death. This does not mean they were unimportant. It means the system that preserved memory was selective. Modern archaeology struggles with this selectivity. Without inscriptions or intact burials, queens become difficult to trace. Their stories survive in fragments, references, and indirect evidence. We reconstruct them through absence. The mystery of Egypt's missing queens reminds us that history is not a complete record. It is a curated one. Decisions made thousands of years ago about who mattered still shape what we can know today. These women lived, ruled, advised, and influenced the course of Egypt. Their disappearance from burial records does not erase their impact. It exposes the limitations of remembrance. As this chapter closes, the missing queens stand as quiet counterpoints to monumental kings. They challenge the idea that power guarantees permanence. In ancient Egypt, eternity was promised, but not equally. And in the gaps where queens should be, we find not emptiness, but the truth that even the most carefully planned civilization could not preserve everyone it depended on. Their tombs are missing. Their influence is not. The Book of Gates and the Afterlife. In the deepest chambers of Egypt's royal tombs, beyond corridors meant for the living, ancient walls begin to tell a different kind of story. It is not a story of this world, but of what comes after it. Painted and carved across stone surfaces are scenes filled with gods, serpents, guardians, and gates, arranged in long, deliberate sequences. This is the Book of Gates, one of the most detailed descriptions of the Egyptian afterlife ever created. The Book of Gates was not meant to comfort the living, it was meant to prepare the dead. Unlike modern ideas of the afterlife as a peaceful continuation, the Egyptian vision was complex, structured, and demanding. The journey after death was dangerous. It required knowledge, timing, and correct alignment with cosmic order. The Book of Gates existed to provide that structure. It describes the passage of the sun god Ra through the underworld during the 12 hours of night. Each hour is marked by a gate, guarded by deities who test, judge, or obstruct passage. Only those who know the names of the gates and their guardians may pass safely. Knowledge was survival. The Book of Gates appears primarily in New Kingdom royal tombs, including those of Seti I, Ramesses II, and later pharaohs. Its placement deep inside burial chambers tells us who it was for. This was not public theology. It was elite instruction, reserved for kings and those close to divine power. The afterlife, like the state, had hierarchy. As Ra travels through the underworld, he encounters both allies and enemies. Souls are judged, punished, rewarded, or destroyed. Some beings are reborn, others are annihilated completely, erased from existence. Eternal life was not guaranteed, it had to be earned. This is a crucial point. Ancient Egyptian belief is often misunderstood as optimistic and assured, but texts like the Book of Gates reveal anxiety. The dead feared failure. They feared judgment. They feared not surviving the night. The gates represent thresholds between states of being. Passing through them required more than moral worth. It required recognition. Names mattered. Order mattered. Correct timing mattered. The afterlife was bureaucratic. Each gate is associated with a specific hour of night, a specific group of gods, and a specific challenge. The dead king, identified with Ra, must move forward continuously. Stopping meant destruction. Hesitation meant erasure. The walls of tombs show this movement as a procession. Ra's solar bark advances through darkness, accompanied by protective deities. Enemies are restrained. Chaos is defeated temporarily. Order is restored by dawn. But this victory resets every night. The Book of Gates does not describe a one-time journey. It describes a cycle. The afterlife required constant renewal. Survival was not permanent by default. It had to be maintained through cosmic balance. This belief reflects how Egyptians understood their world. The sun rose each day, not because it always had, but because it was fought for each night. Existence was fragile. The punishments depicted in the Book of Gates are severe. Enemies of order are decapitated, burned, dismembered, or fed to serpents. These scenes are not symbolic exaggerations. They reflect genuine fear of annihilation. For the Egyptians, the worst fate was not suffering, it was non-existence. This explains why knowledge texts like the Book of Gates were so important. They were not philosophical, they were practical. They gave the dead a script to follow. Knowing the gates meant continuing to be. The placement of the Book of Gates in tombs also tells us something about royal identity. The king was not merely a traveller, he was essential to cosmic stability. By completing the journey with Ra, the king helped ensure the sun would rise again. The afterlife was not private, it was political. This is why these texts appear only in royal context at first. The king's successful journey mattered to everyone. His failure would threaten the world itself. Over time, elements of the Book of Gates influenced non-royal funerary texts. As belief systems evolved, the afterlife became more accessible, but the underlying anxiety remained. The journey was still dangerous. Knowledge was still essential. Standing inside a tomb decorated with the Book of Gates today, the experience is overwhelming, not because of beauty, but because of intensity. There is movement everywhere. Figures are active. The walls feel alive with instruction and warning. This is not art meant to be admired. It is art meant to function. Each scene is positioned carefully, aligned with the architecture of the tomb. The sequence follows the path of movement through the space, guiding the deceased physically as well as spiritually. The tomb itself becomes a map. This transforms how we understand Egyptian burial spaces. They were not static containers, they were journey environments. The Book of Gates also reveals a shift in how Egyptians viewed morality. Earlier beliefs focused heavily on ritual correctness. By the New Kingdom, moral behaviour became more prominent. The afterlife included judgment, not just navigation. The gates tested not only knowledge, but worth. This reflects social change. As Egypt grew more complex, so did its view of responsibility. The afterlife mirrored society, yet despite all this complexity, the goal remained simple. Reach the final gate, survive the night, be reborn with the sun. The Book of Gates ends not with triumph, but with renewal. Dawn breaks. Ra emerges. Order returns. The journey begins again the next night. This cyclical ending is important. Eternity was not a static reward. It was continuous participation. As this chapter closes, the Book of Gates stands as one of the most honest expressions of ancient Egyptian belief. It does not promise peace without effort. It does not hide fear. It does not simplify death. It accepts uncertainty and responds with preparation. The Egyptians did not imagine the afterlife as rest. They imagined it as responsibility. And deep inside their tombs they carved instructions not for memory, but for survival. A reminder that even beyond death, existence had rules, and crossing the gates required understanding them. The Book of Gates was not a story, it was a guide, and for those who believed in it, it was the difference between being remembered and being erased forever.